The training field was alive with the restless energy of new recruits. Rows of young men and women in fatigues moved in stiff formation under the sharp bark of the drill sergeant's voice, each step an attempt at precision, each movement an echo of discipline yet to be perfected. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the dirt beneath their boots and drawing beads of sweat across their foreheads. Some were here out of duty, others from desperation, and a few with the gleam of ambition in their eyes. Among them, a young private named Harris had already gained a small reputation, not for excellence but for his cocky attitude. He was quick with words, quicker with judgment, and too green to understand when silence carried more weight than laughter. That morning, as the recruits assembled near the obstacle course, his restless gaze fell on a figure he had not noticed before, a tall, composed woman who stood slightly apart from the group. Her uniform bore no rank insignia, but what drew his attention were the jagged lines that marred her arms, scars etched like rivers of pain across her skin. They climbed from wrist to elbow, pale and uneven, a brutal testament to wounds long healed but never forgotten. Harris, young and ignorant, let out a snicker. The sound carried farther than he intended in the still air, a sharp and mocking note that drew curious glances from the recruits around him. His voice followed, dripping with cruel amusement. "Guess someone's seen better days. What, did you wrestle barbed wire for fun?" A few nervous chuckles rose from the crowd, not in agreement but in fear of being singled out themselves. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't snap back, didn't bristle, didn't even raise her eyes to acknowledge the insult. Her gaze remained steady, focused somewhere beyond the horizon, calm as a lake untouched by the wind. That composure only fueled Harris's smugness. He mistook her silence for weakness, for shame. He smirked, puffing his chest as if he had won some unspoken contest of words. The recruits around him, however, shifted uncomfortably, sensing something he could not. Because while Harris had only just joined the military, some of them had heard whispers. Stories passed quietly among older soldiers about a woman with scars who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The details varied, the accounts tangled, but they all agreed on one thing. Those scars were not marks of failure, but of survival. The tension in the air thickened as footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, the kind that carried authority. The chatter died instantly, the recruits snapping to attention as a figure came into view at the edge of the field. General Marcus Thorne was a name spoken with respect and often with awe. His presence alone commanded silence. His reputation made sure it lasted. He was not just a leader of soldiers but a symbol of what they aspired to become, hardened by battles, tempered by loss, and unyielding in resolve. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, but it was his eyes that held the recruits in place. They were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and remembered all of it. He scanned the assembly, pausing briefly on each face, and then his gaze fell on the woman standing apart, her scars catching the sunlight like faint silver lines. What happened next froze every recruit in place, especially Harris. The general's stern features softened ever so slightly, his voice breaking the silence with a weight that seemed to anchor the air itself. "Colonel Reyes," he said, each syllable deliberate, each word edged with respect. "Good to see you again." The recruits stiffened, eyes widening in disbelief. "Colonel?" The woman with the scars, the one Harris had mocked, wasn't just another instructor or observer. She was a decorated officer, someone who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the general himself. Harris's smirk evaporated, replaced by a creeping pallor that drained the color from his face. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. The silence pressed down harder now, suffocating in its intensity, until the general turned his gaze directly on him. "Private Harris," General Thorne said, his voice calm yet cutting like a blade drawn slowly across stone. "Do you have something to say about one of the finest soldiers this army has ever known?" The question wasn't loud, but it thundered in Harris's chest. Every eye in the company was on him, waiting, judging, condemning. His earlier bravado shriveled under the weight of the general's stare. He shook his head quickly, his voice faltering. "And no, sir." But General Thorne wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Colonel Reyes, gesturing slightly toward her scars. "Do you see these marks, recruits? Do you think there's something to laugh at? Each one tells a story, of battles fought, of lives saved, of courage when retreat would have been easier. Colonel Reyes has bled for every one of you standing here, though you don't yet realize it. She carries scars not because she was weak. Hush settled deeper over the field, the kind of silence that carved itself into memory. Harris wished the earth would open beneath him and swallow him whole, but no such mercy came. He stood frozen, face burning with humiliation as the weight of his ignorance bore down on him. Around him, the other recruits looked at Colonel Reyes with newfound eyes, not of pity but of reverence. The scars they had once seen as disfigurement now seemed like metals more permanent than anything a ribbon or a pin could signify. And through it all, Colonel Reyes remained still, her calm unbroken, though a faint glimmer of pride flickered in her gaze when she met the general's eyes. For Harris, the lesson cut deeper than any reprimand. His laughter, once casual and thoughtless, had been silenced by a truth he could never unhear. The recruit stood motionless as General Thorne's words sank in, but Harris felt every syllable like a weight pressing against his chest. His earlier laughter echoed in his mind, mocking him now, crueler than any insult he had intended for another. He had exposed his ignorance in front of everyone, not just the recruits but before a general and a colonel whose very presence demanded respect. Colonel Reyes had not spoken a single word since he mocked her, yet her silence had carved deeper into him than any rebuke could have. She stood calm, scars bare against the sun, as if daring the world to look and understand what they represented. The recruits shifted uneasily, some staring at Harris with contempt, others with quiet relief that they hadn't been the one to open their mouths. The general's eyes, sharp and unwavering, moved from Harris back to the formation. "Remember this moment," he said, his voice steady but heavy with authority. "Every scar on a soldier's body is a testament to what they endured so that others might live. If you ever find yourself tempted to mock such marks again, think about whether you've earned the right to carry any of your own. Discipline is not just about marching in line. It is about respect. Respect for those who came before you, for those beside you, and for those who will follow after." The recruits responded with a crisp, "Yes, sir," though their voices wavered under the weight of the lesson. Harris's was the weakest of them all, his throat dry, the sound barely more than a whisper. The general held his gaze a moment longer before giving a slight nod to Colonel Reyes. It was the kind of gesture that carried decades of shared battles, a quiet recognition between warriors who had walked through the same storms. Reyes scrunched against the dirt, and the recruits tensed instinctively. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes swept across them with the cool precision of a commander evaluating her troops. When she spoke, her voice was not harsh, not bitter, but steady and unshaken, each word deliberate. "You will all learn in time that scars are part of this life. Some will be visible like mine. Others you'll carry inside, where no one can see them but where they'll weigh just as heavy. None of you are here to remain untouched. You are here to learn how to endure, how to keep moving forward even when it feels like you cannot take another step. If you cannot respect those who already have, then you do not belong here." The statement landed harder than any punishment drill could. A few recruits glanced at Harris, expecting her to call him out directly, but she did not. She didn't need to. By speaking to all of them, she ensured that Harris's humiliation was complete without reducing herself to pettiness. He had already condemned himself with his own words. She turned sharply, giving the general a crisp nod before walking away toward the far end of the training ground, her scars catching the sunlight one last time before fading into shadow beneath the awning. The silence that followed her departure, his gaze sweeping over the recruits like a storm scanning the horizon. Then, without raising his voice, he issued his command. "Back to training. And do it properly. Every obstacle, every drill, do it as if your life depends on it because one day it will." His words cracked like a whip, and the recruits scrambled into motion. The clatter of boots and the sound of bodies hitting the obstacle course filled the air again, though this time with a sharper edge of determination. Even the laziest among them pushed harder, unwilling to risk drawing the general's ire. Harris stumbled through the first hurdles, his mind distracted by the burning shame in his chest. Every grunt, every scrape of his boots against the dirt felt heavier than before. He could still see her scars in his mind, could still hear the general's voice cutting into him. What had she done to earn them? What battles had she fought? The questions churned inside him, bitter and unrelenting. For the first time he began to realize that the army was not a place for swagger and empty bravado. It was a place where respect was not optional, where strength was not measured by words but by the burdens one carried. As the recruits pushed themselves through the course, Thorne remained at the sidelines, arms folded, eyes sharp. He saw every hesitation, every misstep, every ounce of weakness. Yet his gaze lingered often where Harris struggled. Not because he wished to single him out again but because the boy had reached a crossroads. The general had seen dozens like him before, young, cocky, blinded by the illusion of toughness until reality stripped them bare. Some learned from the experience, grew stronger, and became soldiers worthy of their uniform. Others broke beneath the weight of their arrogance, fading into obscurity. Harris had not yet decided which he would be, but the choice was closing in on him fast. By the time the drill ended, sweat poured down the recruits' faces, their muscles trembling, their chests heaving. They lined up once more, exhausted but standing tall. The general approached slowly, his boots echoing with each step. He looked them over, pausing on Harris for a fraction longer before speaking. "You will remember today," he said. "Not because of the pain in your arms or the sweat on your back, but because you were reminded of what it means to wear this uniform. You are not here for yourselves. You are here for something greater, something that demands sacrifice. If you cannot understand that, you should leave now. Better to walk away than to stand here mocking those who've already paid the price." His eyes bored into Harris one last time before scanning the others. "Dismissed." The recruits saluted sharply and began to disperse, whispering among themselves. Some glanced at Harris with pity, others with disdain. He remained rooted in place, staring at the dirt beneath his boots, the weight of his mistake pressing harder with each breath. The laughter that had once come so easily to him now felt like a distant, shameful memory. He had mocked what he did not understand, and in doing so revealed just how far he still had to go. Harris barely slept that night. The barracks were filled with the steady breathing and occasional snores of his fellow recruits, but for him, rest remained elusive. Every time he closed his eyes he saw her, Colonel Reyes standing in the sunlight, scars glinting faintly, her silence unshaken in the face of his mockery. Then the general's voice would echo through his thoughts, heavy and unyielding. "One of the finest soldiers this army has ever known." Those words did not leave him. He had thought scars were ugly, something to be ridiculed, but now he realized they were records, carved into the flesh, of sacrifices he couldn't yet comprehend. Shame gnawed at him, but beneath it stirred something new, something respect. Morning came harsh and early, the bugle's sharp cry pulling him from his restless half-sleep. His body ached from the previous day's drills, but the ache in his chest was heavier. He moved with the others, forcing himself into line, forcing his face into the blank mask of a soldier, though inside his thoughts burned. Colonel Reyes was waiting on the training field when they arrived. No longer standing apart, she was at the forefront now, her presence commanding without the need for words. The recruits straightened instinctively, their eyes drawn to her, some in awe, some in unease, all remembering the lesson from the day before. Harris's throat tightened as he caught sight of her, but she didn't glance his way. She scanned the recruits with steady eyes, her face expressionless, her posture sharp. When she spoke, her voice carried with crisp authority. "Today you will run the endurance course. It is not about speed. It is about perseverance. Some of you will stumble, some will falter, but none of you will quit. Not unless you want your time here to end today." The recruits shouted their affirmation, though nerves laced their voices. The endurance course was notorious. Miles of grueling terrain, obstacles designed not just to test physical limits but to break mental ones. For recruits so fresh, it was a crucible. They set off in staggered groups, boots pounding against the dirt, lungs burning almost immediately under the relentless pace. Harris pushed himself harder than he ever had, but the weight of shame pressed on him with every step. He refused to fall behind, refused to give any more reason to stand out for the wrong reasons. The course dragged on, each obstacle harder than the last. Rope climbs, mud crawls, walls to scale, trenches to wade. Sweat blurred his vision, dirt stung his eyes, his muscles screamed, but he kept moving. Around him, recruits stumbled, cursed, and gasped for breath. A few fell out entirely, their bodies unable to match their will. Harris wanted to stop more than once, his chest heaving as if it might burst, but every time the thought of quitting flickered through his mind, he saw her scars again. He imagined the pain it must have taken to earn them, the battles she must have endured, and the thought of surrendering now filled him with disgust. He pressed on. Halfway through the course, Harris's strength began to fail him. His hands slipped on the rope climb, his body collapsing into the dirt. For a moment he stayed down, gasping, the urge to quit overwhelming. Then he heard a voice, low, firm, steady. "On your feet, Private." He looked up, chest burning, to see Colonel Reyes standing nearby. She wasn't yelling, wasn't berating him like the drill sergeants. She simply watched him, her eyes locked onto his, her voice calm but commanding. "Pain is part of the process. You don't get stronger by avoiding it. Now move." Her presence struck him harder than any insult could. He forced himself up, hands shaking, and grabbed the rope again. Every muscle screamed, every breath tore at his lungs, but he climbed. He reached the top, hauled himself over, and dropped to the other side, collapsing into the dirt with exhaustion but also with a spark of something he had never felt before: pride. Reyes didn't praise him. She didn't need to. She simply nodded once before moving on, her focus shifting to another recruit. But for Harris, that nod was everything. It was acknowledgement, not forgiveness but recognition, and it lit something inside him that the shame alone never could. He continued through the rest of the course, stumbling, dragging himself through the mud, but he did not stop. By the end, when the recruits collapsed in the dust, Harris was among them, his body battered, his lungs ragged, but his head was held higher than the day before. Later, as they filed back toward the barracks, Harris caught fragments of whispers among the others. Stories about Reyes, passed quietly from those who claimed to know pieces of her past. Some said she had survived an ambush that had wiped out an entire unit, pulling wounded comrades from burning wreckage until her skin was scorched and torn. Others claimed she had held the line against overwhelming enemy forces, refusing to retreat even when the odds were hopeless. The details shifted with each telling, but the message was the same: she was more than her scars. She was living proof of what it meant to endure. Harris listened in silence, his earlier arrogance burned away by fatigue and the sting of his lesson. He didn't know which stories were true, but he no longer doubted that she had earned every ounce of the respect she commanded. That night, when the barracks quieted again, Harris lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shame still lingered, but it no longer crushed him. Instead, it drove him. He knew he couldn't erase what he had said, couldn't undo the insult. But maybe, just maybe, he could learn from it. He could change. The army had stripped away his illusions in the harshest way possible, but it had also given him something new, a glimpse of what real strength looked like. And for the first time, Harris wanted not just to survive, but to become a soldier worthy of standing in the shadow of people like her. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion and discipline. Reveille at dawn, drills that pushed their bodies past breaking, lessons that drilled into their minds the merciless realities of war. For most recruits, the routine was a grind they simply endured, but for Harris, it became something else. A crucible where he tried, day by day, to burn away the arrogance that had once defined him. He kept his head down, worked harder than before, and when fatigue begged him to slack, he remembered Reyes's calm stare as she told him to move. That memory fueled him more than fear of punishment ever could. The recruits noticed the change. The smirk that had once played on his lips was gone, replaced by a seriousness that surprised them. Some mocked him in whispers, calling it guilt. Maybe it was. But Harris didn't care. He knew he had to prove, if not to Reyes or the general, then at least to himself, that he was more than the fool who had laughed at scars he didn't understand. One evening, after a brutal set of endurance runs that left the recruits sprawled like broken dolls in the dirt, Reyes gathered them beneath the fading orange sky. The air was heavy with dust and sweat, but her voice carried clean and sharp as ever. "You think training is hard? You think you've been pushed to your limits?" She let the silence stretch a beat before continuing. "This is nothing. Out there, limits don't exist. Out there, it isn't about whether you're tired or scared or hurt. It's about whether you keep moving when everything in you says stop. It's about whether you can take the hit and keep going anyway." Her eyes swept the recruits, lingering for just a moment on Harris. He felt the weight of that glance settle deep inside, not condemnation but a test. She wasn't finished. "You want to know what scars mean? They mean you fought when it mattered. They mean you didn't quit. They mean you carried something heavier than yourself and you didn't let it break you." The recruits listened in silence, transfixed. None dared to speak, none dared to laugh, because her words carved into them the reality that no drill could show. For Harris, each sentence drove deeper than the last. He wanted to ask her, how? How had she carried her scars so calmly? How had she endured without breaking? But his voice caught in his throat. He had no right to demand her story. Not yet. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. He wanted to understand, not from whispers or rumors but from her. He wanted to know what she had faced because maybe in her story he could find the strength to face his own weaknesses. The chance came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, during night exercises, the recruits were tasked with navigating a darkened stretch of forest in full gear. No lights, no shortcuts, only compass and instinct. They moved in groups of 3, Harris paired with 2 others. The terrain was rough, shadows twisting into illusions, every sound magnified by the tension of the task. Harris's group stumbled more than once, and by the time they reached the rendezvous point, they were among the last to arrive. Reyes stood there, waiting, her arms folded, eyes sharp even in the dim moonlight. She didn't speak, didn't scold, but when Harris met her gaze, something passed between them, recognition that he was still fighting even if he struggled. As the recruits were dismissed back to the barracks, Harris hesitated. His companions trudged ahead, muttering about their exhaustion, but Harris lingered, his boots rooted in the dirt. Reyes noticed, of course. Her eyes flicked to him. "Something on your mind, Private?" The words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. "Ma'am? He faltered, then tried again. "I want to understand. The scars." "Not," he swallowed, his voice. "Not. You." The silence that followed stretched long enough for him to regret speaking at all. Then Reyes exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought she would dismiss him. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him like a commander deciding if a soldier was ready for what came next. At last she spoke, her voice quieter now, edged not with command but with memory. "They mean survival. They mean pain. They mean choices I wouldn't wish on anyone." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. Harris didn't press, didn't dare. But she went on, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him, as if the trees themselves conjured old ghosts. "There was a night," she said, her tone flat, almost detached, "when my unit was ambushed. Outnumbered 3-1. We fought until the ammunition ran out, then with knives, then with our hands. I was ordered to fall back. I didn't. I stayed because 3 of my soldiers were pinned, 2 wounded to move. I dragged them out one by one while fire tore through the field. By the time I got them clear, the skin on my arms was burned, cut open by shrapnel. The pain doesn't go away, Private. Neither do the faces of those I saved. The men to see them live another day." Harris's chest tightened as he listened. The forest around them seemed to fade until there was only her voice and the weight of what she carried. He had imagined battles before, but never with this clarity, never with the raw cost she laid bare. He saw her scars differently now, not just as marks of endurance but as reminders of choices that had carved her soul as much as her body. He lowered his eyes, ashamed anew. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words small but sincere. Reyes didn't soften, didn't smile, but her silence spoke volumes. She had given him more than he deserved, and she knew he would carry it. With a curt nod, she dismissed him. "Get some rest, Private. You'll need it." That night, Harris lay awake again, but it was different now. The shame was still there, but alongside it was something else, resolve. He understood now that scars weren't marks of weakness but of sacrifice, and he knew he had a long way to go before he could ever hope to bear them with the same strength. But for the first time since he arrived, he wanted to. The following week brought with it the kind of test no amount of scheduled training could ever prepare them for. A storm had rolled in overnight, hammering the base. By morning, the recruits were already soaked through, their uniforms clinging like second skin, their boots filled with mud. The instructors, unmoved by the weather, saw it as an opportunity. Where others might postpone drills, they intensified them. "The battlefield doesn't wait for sunshine," one sergeant barked as he ordered the recruits onto the obstacle course, now slick with water and treacherous underfoot. Harris braced himself, forcing his weary legs to respond, but every step was a struggle. The rain blinded him, the mud sucked at his boots, and the obstacles that had seemed difficult on dry ground now loomed like impossible walls. All around him, recruits stumbled, cursed, and fell. Yet through the chaos, Reyes's voice cut across the storm. "Keep moving. The rain doesn't care if you're tired. The mud doesn't care if you slip. The enemy doesn't wait for you to get comfortable. Move." Harris pushed forward, his chest burning, his muscles trembling. He climbed the rope wall, slipping twice before managing to heave himself over the top. He landed hard on the other side, nearly twisting his ankle in the muck, but he didn't stop. Every fiber of his body screamed for rest, but he remembered Reyes's words. "You don't get stronger by avoiding it." He ground his teeth and pressed on, crawling through mud so thick it threatened to swallow him whole. When his arms threatened to give out, he imagined her dragging wounded soldiers from fire. If she could carry that weight, he could carry his own body through the dirt. He refused to be the man who mocked scars anymore. Halfway through, the storm worsened. Lightning split the sky, thunder rattled the air, and the rain came down in sheets so thick it blurred the world into gray. Visibility was nearly gone, and the obstacle ahead, a high log balanced slick with water, became a gauntlet. Recruits slipped and fell hard into the mud below, some injuring themselves, others rising battered to try again. Harris's turn came and fear gnawed at him. His legs trembled as he stepped onto the log, arms stretched for balance. The wood was slick, the wind howled, and halfway across his foot slipped. He dropped to one knee, arms flailing, heart hammering as he clung desperately to the log. Below him, the mud waited like a hungry pit. The jeers he might have once given to another recruit flashed in his mind, but now he heard only Reyes's voice, steady and commanding, "Don't quit." Gritting his teeth, he pulled himself upright to the other side. When he finally dropped to solid ground, chest heaving, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, confidence, raw and unsteady but real. The course ended with a final dash through knee-deep mud, the recruits collapsing in exhaustion as they finished. Harris fell among them, every muscle screaming, but for once he wasn't ashamed. He had pushed himself past the breaking point, and though his body was battered, he had not quit. Reyes stood at the finish line, rain plastering her hair to her face, her uniform drenched, but she looked untouched by the storm. Her gaze swept over the recruits, sharp as ever, but when her eyes fell on Harris, he swore he saw the faintest flicker of approval. She gave no words, only the smallest nod before turning away. That single gesture burned hotter in his chest than any metal could. But the storm was not the only trial that week. 2 days later, an exercise meant to simulate battlefield conditions pushed them into an even harsher crucible. Instructors staged a mock rescue scenario deep in the training grounds. A group of recruits would be tasked with reaching wounded comrades and carrying them to safety while under simulated fire. Smoke grenades filled the air, sirens blared, and paint rounds cracked through the night, striking the pain stings. It was chaos by design, meant to overwhelm. Harris was assigned as part of a squad tasked with retrieving one of the dummies placed as a casualty. They charged into the smoke, hearts pounding, senses scrambled by the cacophony. The ground was uneven, branches clawed at them, and the sting of paint rounds peppered their uniforms. Harris's squad reached the dummy, but one of his teammates panicked, freezing under the relentless noise. Paint splattered inches from his head, and he dropped to the ground, covering his ears. Harris's chest tightened. This was it, the moment where weakness either spread like poison or someone stepped up. Without hesitation, Harris grabbed the panicked recruit by the shoulder, shaking him hard. "Get up. We don't leave anyone behind." His voice cracked but carried urgency. The recruit's wide eyes stared at him, paralyzed with fear. Harris didn't wait. He slung the recruit's arm over his shoulder, grabbed the dummy with his free hand and staggered forward. His body screamed under the weight, the smoke burned his lungs, but he moved. Step by step, he dragged both burdens toward safety. The paint rounds stung his arms and back, one striking hard against his ribs, nearly toppling him. He wanted to scream, wanted to collapse, but Reyes's story burned in his mind, her dragging soldiers through fire, her refusal to retreat. He clenched his jaw and kept moving. By the time he stumbled across the finish line, both the recruit and the dummy in tow, his vision blurred with sweat and smoke. The instructors barked orders, herding the rest of the squad to safety, but Harris barely heard them. He collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, body trembling on the edge of collapse. When he looked up through the haze, Reyes stood nearby, watching. Her eyes met his, and this time the nod was unmistakable, sharper, fuller, filled with something that looked very close to respect. For Harris it was everything. He had stumbled, he had nearly fallen, but he had carried the weight anyway. In that moment, he understood what she meant when she said scars were the price of survival. He had none yet, not carved into his skin, but for the first time, he felt like he had begun to earn the right to carry them one day. The weeks that followed hardened the recruits in ways none of them had anticipated. The storm in the rescue drill had stripped away the last illusions anyone held about training being just exercises. It wasn't practice anymore. It was preparation for the reality that someday, in some distant field of fire, lives would depend on whether they could endure. Harris carried that weight more than most. Each night when exhaustion pinned him to his bunk, he replayed Reyes's words in his head, the way she had spoken about scars, about the choices that carved them into her skin. He thought of the recruit he had dragged through the smoke, the terror in that boy's eyes, and how easy it would have been to leave him behind. Once, the old Harris might have laughed off someone else's weakness. Now, he understood that survival wasn't about leaving the weakest to fall, it was about carrying them anyway. That realization changed him. Slowly the recruits began to notice. He no longer tried to be the loudest voice or the one with the easy jokes. Instead, he was the one offering a hand when someone stumbled, the one pushing hardest in the mud, the one who kept moving no matter how battered his body felt. Respect among recruits came quietly, earned in sweat and silence, and Harris was earning it. But change always comes with a test. Midway through their training cycle, The recruits were ordered into a 48-hour field exercise known simply as the Gauntlet. It was infamous among soldiers, a rite of passage that separated those fit to wear the uniform from those who would wash out. They were given minimal supplies, little sleep, and endless challenges strung together to simulate the chaos of combat. Forced marches through rough terrain, obstacle runs under fire, ambush drills, and survival tasks that tested every ounce of endurance. The first day chewed at them like a relentless machine. Feet blistered, bodies broke, minds cracked under pressure. By the second night, they were shadows of themselves, staggering under the weight of exhaustion. Harris felt it too. His shoulders ached as though iron weights had been fastened to them, his legs were raw from the miles of marching, and his stomach burned with hunger. The thought of quitting whispered to him with every step. But then he would remember Reyes's voice, calm, firm, uncompromising. You don't get stronger by avoiding pain. That memory pushed him forward when nothing else could. On the final day, the recruits were ordered into their last trial, a simulated assault on a fortified position, complete with blank rounds, smoke and paint fire to mimic the chaos of battle. They were divided into squads, each responsible for advancing across open ground, seizing cover, and reaching the final objective. Harris's squad moved quickly, hearts pounding, lungs burning, the cacophony of simulated gunfire hammering their ears. They sprinted from cover to cover, mud flying as they threw themselves into the dirt. But midway through the push, disaster struck. One of the recruits, a wiry boy named Jensen, tripped over a root and went down hard. His ankle twisted beneath him with a sickening snap. His scream cut through the din, raw and panicked, and he clutched his leg, unable to rise. The squad froze for an instant, torn between pressing on or turning back. The instructors, watching from the sidelines, made no move to intervene. This was part of the test. Harris didn't hesitate. The old Harris might have rolled his eyes, cursed Jensen for slowing them down, and kept moving. But now, as paint rounds cracked around him, he sprinted back through the smoke, dropping into the mud beside Jensen. "Get up!" he shouted, but one look at the boy's swollen ankle told him the truth: he couldn't. Jensen shook his head, teeth gritted against the pain. "Leave me. Just go." Harris grabbed him by the vest, eyes blazing. "We don't leave anyone behind." With a grunt, he hauled Jensen onto his back, the added weight nearly buckling him. His muscles screamed, his lungs clawed for air, but he staggered forward anyway, each step dragging through the mud like he was carrying a mountain. Paint rounds peppered his body, stinging against his skin, but he pushed on, teeth clenched, vision blurring. The rest of the squad had reached cover and shouted for him to hurry, their voices barely cutting through the roar of gunfire and explosions. Every instinct told him to drop Jensen to save himself, but he remembered Reyes's story, the fire, the wounded soldiers, the price she paid in scars. She hadn't left them. How could he? Step by agonizing step, Harris carried Jensen forward until he collapsed into the cover of the squad's position. His arms trembled, his chest heaved like it might burst, but he had made it. The squad rallied, surging forward for the final push, and Harris, battered but unbroken, dragged himself up to follow. Together they seized the objective, the final signal flare marking the end of the gauntlet. When it was over, the recruits were called into formation. Mud caked their uniforms, sweat stung their eyes, but they stood tall, knowing they had survived what had broken so many before them. General Thorne himself oversaw the conclusion, his presence commanding silence as he surveyed the line. He praised the unit for their endurance, but when his gaze fell on Harris, it lingered. Thorne said nothing at first, but then his voice rang out, steady and deliberate. There are moments that define a soldier. Not when the path is easy, but when the weight is carried. Harris, today you carried more than your own weight. You carried another man when leaving him would have been simpler. That is the measure of a soldier. The recruits turned their eyes to Harris, stunned. Just weeks ago he had been the fool who mocked scars, and now the general himself was commending him in front of them all. Harris's throat tightened, but he stood straighter, chest rising with something he had not felt before, pride that was not arrogance but earned. Reyes stood nearby, silent as ever, but when Harris's eyes met hers, he saw it, the faintest trace of approval, the same quiet recognition she had once given him in the mud. No words passed between them, but none were needed. She had taught him without lectures, shown him without boasting, and now he understood. Scars were not shame. Scars were proof. And one day he would carry his own, not as a badge of mockery but as a mark of survival, sacrifice and strength. The days after the gauntlet felt different, as if the entire barracks had shifted in its center of gravity. The recruits looked at Harris no longer as the loudmouth who had mocked Scars but as someone who had proved himself when the moment mattered most. Even Jensen, hobbling on crutches, wore a kind of fierce gratitude in his eyes every time they passed. Respect, Harris realized, wasn't demanded, it was given when earned. And yet, beneath the quiet pride, there was something else stirring in him. A question that refused to be silenced. What kind of soldier am I becoming? The answer wasn't simple. Every bruise, every sleepless night, every memory of Reyes's scarred hands and steady gaze pressed him to think deeper than he ever had. He had mocked pain once. Now he feared he might crave it, as though it was the only honest teacher left in his life. That unease lingered even as the training cycle pushed them into the final stretch. It was during this last phase that Reyes's past, long whispered about in fragments, finally came into the open. The recruits had gathered in the mess hall when the announcement came. Colonel Reyes would be delivering a lecture on combat leadership. Some groaned, expecting another lecture on discipline, but Harris felt a tension tighten in his chest. He knew enough to suspect that whatever Reyes said now would not be theory, it would be revelation. When she walked to the front, the room stilled. Her posture was rigid as always, her face carved with the calmness of someone who had seen too much. She stood there for a moment, eyes sweeping over the young faces before her, and then, without preamble, she began. Some of you know pieces of my history. Rumors. Afterus. Let me give you the whole of it. Her voice was level, but beneath it was steel sharpened by memory. She told them of a night years ago on a distant battlefield, a night where her unit had been ambushed in the ruins of a collapsed city. She was a lieutenant then, inexperienced, commanding men older than her. The firefight raged through shattered buildings, smoke thick as tar, screams echoing against crumbling walls. When an explosion tore through the street, half her platoon went down in an instant. She remembered dragging one man after another from the flames, hands burning, lungs filling with smoke. She remembered the moment she had to decide between retreat and holding the line, and how she had chosen to stand, even when the cost was carved into her flesh forever. Her voice did not tremble as she spoke of the scars, the fire that seared her arms, the shrapnel that tore her side, the faces she carried in memory because not all of them had lived. The room was silent, recruits staring at her with wide eyes, Harris feeling the words strike like hammer blows. She ended simply, "You will all carry scars whether on your bodies or in your hearts. Don't waste them by pretending they don't matter. They are the story of who you chose to be when the world demanded everything of you." For Harris, it was like the last piece of a puzzle locking into place. He remembered his mocking words on that first day, how small they felt now in the shadow of her truth. But more than guilt, he felt a surge of clarity. If scars were the story of choices, then what story would his tell? Would they speak of arrogance and selfishness, or of carrying another man through fire when it would have been easier to run? He didn't know yet, but the question burned in him, reshaping every thought about the future. That night, lying awake in the barracks while the others slept, he turned Reyes's words over and over. He could see her standing there, scarred and unflinching, and he realized she was not just an instructor. She was the example, the standard. And for the first time in his life, Harris wanted, not to impress, not to mock, not to get through, but to live up to something greater than himself. The final test of the cycle came sooner than any of them expected. A surprise drill, announced in the dead of night, dragged them from their bunks and thrust them into a simulated deployment. They had 48 hours to establish a defensive perimeter in rough terrain, coordinate logistics, and repel wave after wave of simulated attacks. Fatigue gnawed at them, the cold seeped into their bones, and the endless pressure threatened to break their coordination. It was during one of the heaviest simulated assaults, when smoke and noise swallowed the field, that Harris found himself in a leadership role he had not asked for. His squad leader was taken out in the simulation, leaving Harris the highest-ranked standing. The others looked at him, waiting. For a heartbeat he froze, old instincts clawing at him to shrug responsibility. But then Reyes's words returned. Scars are the story of choices. He forced his voice steady, issuing orders, pulling his squad into tighter positions, keeping them moving instead of collapsing into chaos. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled, made mistakes, hesitated when he should have pressed forward. But he did not abandon his role. He bore it, trembling though he was, and when the final flare signaled the end of the exercise, his squad was still together, still fighting. The instructors marked it as a success. Harris didn't feel victorious, only drained, but when he caught Reyes watching from a distance, her eyes steady on him, he understood. Leadership wasn't about flawless execution. It was about standing in the fire and refusing to let the weight crush you. He had done that, however clumsily. And in that moment, Harris knew his story was beginning to be written in scars he could not yet see. As the recruits stood in formation for the final time before graduation, Harris felt the gravity of the weeks behind him settle into his bones. He thought of the boy who had mocked pain, who had sneered at scars, and he barely recognized him. That boy had been burned away in mud, smoke, and sacrifice. In his place stood someone still untested by real war, but forged enough to know what mattered. He met Reza's gaze one last time, and for the briefest second her lips curved, not a smile, not quite, but something close, as if acknowledging the path he had walked. Harris didn't need more. He knew the truth now. The story of a soldier was written not in glory but in scars, and when his came, he would bear them with the same unflinching resolve he had once mocked. Graduation day arrived beneath a cold sky streaked with pale morning light. The recruits stood in their pressed uniforms, boots gleaming, shoulders square despite the exhaustion that still clung to their frames. The parade ground was alive with anticipation, the distant sound of families gathered in the stands, officers moving with crisp precision, the banners of the division snapping in the wind. For many, it was a day of pride, a culmination of months of relentless strife. Something else entirely. He felt as if he were standing on the threshold of two lives, the one he had entered this place with, full of arrogance and carelessness, and the one he was now stepping into, tempered, humbled, and reshaped by fire. The others might see only a young man in uniform, but inside, he carried the invisible weight of every lesson carved into him, every scar of the soul that whispered of choices made under pressure. The ceremony began with speeches as expected, generals extolling discipline, officers praising the sacrifice of the recruits, the anthem rising across the field. Yet Harris barely heard the words. His eyes strayed to Reyes, who stood at the edge of the platform, her posture as rigid and unyielding as ever. She was not there to celebrate. She was there as a reminder of what came next. War was no abstraction for her, no parade ground spectacle. She had stood where they were about to stand, had bled for it,